Hi, my name is Nora Gelperin. I'm the Director of Sexuality Education and Training at Advocates for Youth. Thanks for joining me as we review how to create inclusive classrooms for transgender and gender expansive students. We know this is an issue that has changed really quickly in the past 5, 10 years, and our understanding of people who are transgender and particularly how that impacts our schools has deepened as well. Let's start with some simple definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. We know that gender identity is really one's understanding of their innermost self as female, male, a blend of both, or perhaps neither. One's gender identity can be the same or different from the sex they were assigned at birth. Here are two common terms you might hear related to gender identity: cisgender. Most people identify as cisgender when their gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth, and some people identify as transgender, which is really an umbrella term for people whose gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth. Here are some possible identities that you may hear connected to gender identity. Again, just a list of some of them. There are many more than this, and this is changing all the time. We at Advocates for Youth use gender expansive. We find that to be the most inclusive and welcoming term, but your agency and school district may use different terminology. It's really different all around the country. I often get asked how many young people are we talking about, and thanks to recent research from the Williams Institute, we know it's about 150,000 young people in their teen years that identify as transgender. So that's a lot of young people in our schools and in our communities. There was really recent research done by the Human Rights Campaign and the Gender Spectrum that involved 10,000 young people that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. This is specifically about the 925 youth that identify as transgender or gender expansive, so narrowing in on those particular results. And we can really look at some very recent and substantial data about these young people and what they need from us. One of the most concerning things that jumps right out is about the level of happiness, or the lack thereof, I should say. When compared to their heterosexual cisgender peers, we know that students who identify as transgender and gender expansive really report much less happiness. You'll see this quote from a young person is really speaking very eloquently about those issues in particular. We also know there are a lot of challenges around peer acceptance and use of alcohol and drugs as a way to cope with a lot of that unhappiness and lack of acceptance. We know that in particular, sense of belonging, there's lots of struggles there for transgender and gender expansive youth. And on the right hand side, you'll see that there are a lot fewer caring adults that these young people can turn to and confide in as they're seeking help and support as they deal with all of these challenges ahead of them. So then what should we do as educators, as teachers, as caring adults? There are really some very simple techniques that we can use both in the classroom, in school districts, and community-wide. I'll just review some of them real briefly. I'm guessing it's a review for some of you, and for others it may be new information. There are many simple changes to our language, to our teaching practices, and really to our policies as well that can help us make our classrooms more inclusive. To start with, for language, there are some very simple tweaks we can make to just how we talk about sexuality education when we're teaching our lessons. For example, instead of saying a girl who is pregnant, just change it to a person who is pregnant. Instead of saying a guy's scrotum or a male's scrotum, say a person's scrotum. Very, very simple stuff. Instead of her labia or vulva, which assumes someone's gender identity, just say the vulva or labia. Pretty straightforward. Same here with the example around erections or getting periods. Other adjustments to language when we talk about transgender people and issues related to being transgender. Here's some examples here. Saying sex assigned at birth, as you've heard me say throughout this. Instead of saying transgendered as a past tense, really talking about the person first, so a person who is transgender or a transgender person, using more updated language like medical transition, and instead of saying used to be someone or something, saying what's more accurate, which would be trans boy or trans girl. And then when we do hear instances of transphobia in our classrooms, in the hallways, from our students, it's really important to intervene. And there are 3 easy steps to doing that. To first tell students to cut it out, to stop it, and to talk about why that's not appropriate. And then to name what the word was or the phrase was that was offensive and talk about why it's not okay to use that phrase or that term in school. And then lastly, to really claim that people who are transgender or gender nonconforming, gender expansive, expansive deserve to be treated with dignity and respect just like everybody else, and make sure to reinforce that that's not appropriate or acceptable in classroom in the future. There's also some really easy adjustments we can make to our instructional practices. Here's an easy one talking about having students introduce themselves. Instead of just going down your roster or the list you were provided, allow young people to tell you what their names are that they prefer to be called. So you can not only hear the pronunciation, but hear the gender pronouns that they use, and make sure that we can use those names going forward in our programs. Some other ideas about instructional practices: make sure to use they, them until you hear from the young person what their gender pronouns are. Make sure to try to avoid dividing by gender. It's a pretty arbitrary way to divide students up anyway, and it doesn't resonate with all of our students. Also, to degender as much as we can. So, whether it's colors or profession or sports or hobbies, just to make sure that everyone can have opportunities and see themselves in all the different ways that our instruction plays out. We also know it really goes beyond just instructional strategies as well. We see that inclusivity goes around field trips, around locker rooms, yearbook pictures, graduation robes. There's so many ways that this really impacts our students. I really found this idea from a physical educator a really great way to think about doing something a little bit different, about handing out lockers for students in changing rooms. And instead of calling up genders one at a time, just doing it more randomly. What a simple but powerful change that this educator made when teaching PE. Just terrific. So, last but not least, here are some really important resources to make sure you're familiar with from GLISTEN and from the Teaching Transgender Training Institute on the left. Also, some really terrific resources from Gender Spectrum and Human Rights Campaign. And lastly, just something to keep in mind as an educator: when someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. So, to keep in mind for us as we're doing this work, it's not simple, it's not easy, but it's very, very important, and at times it could even be life saving.